1994's Cyborg Cop 2 is an action thriller that's steeped in science fiction and is a definite step in the right direction, in my opinion, from the original. The original Cyborg Cop was a fine movie, enjoyable even in places, but to me, it kinda struggled to escape the shadow of the Terminator and danced the line very narrowly between wanting to be taken seriously and wanting to be a campy, over-the-top mess of a movie. As such, it kind of fell between two chairs and ended up as a film that was both too goofy to be considered a serious sci-fi flick, but nowhere near campy enough to be considered tongue-in-cheek about its subject. With that in mind, there was only really two ways the series could have gone. It could have smartened up, gone serious, and tried to push to become something genuinely impressive as a work of science fiction, or it could have embraced the farce and become a ridiculous, over-the-top mess of weird performances, stunts, and explosions. And, ladies and gentlemen, when I tell you that Riff Tracks covered this movie in 2014, well, I hope that shows you which way the wind is blowing here. Pretty much anything to do with the original film has gone far, far out the window, and barring a couple of design choices and the cyborgs, the filmmakers have decided to thrust us into a world of the absurd as we rejoin David Bradley as Jack Ryan, now back on the beat, and with the first film thoroughly wanting to be the Terminator, this film's decided to move on and is now desperately trying to be Terminator 2. Only, it's Terminator 2 with a dash of RoboCop 2 thrown in for good measure. You see, the film opens with a terrorist group destroying a cocaine processing plant because the leader of the gang, Jesse, is owed money by the plant operator. When the owner, Fats, refuses to pay, a gunfight breaks out and the police head over. And a short time after that standoff happens, the regular cops realise they're in way over their heads and call in the SWAT team. Before the SWAT arrive, however, Jack rocks up to the scene wearing a leather jacket and riding a hog because Terminator 2. He casually strolls into the warehouse and, despite his captain telling him not to, he just wanders right into the back room and talks to Jesse. It's then revealed that a year prior to the events of this film, Jack murdered Jesse's brother, and Jesse is out for revenge. A brief skirmish ensues as Jack and Jesse have a box fight and Jesse takes a hostage. In the resulting scuffle though, Jack's partner, Mike, who's kind of not really introduced properly or given anything to do, he just sort of floats around the edge of the scene, gets shot by Jesse, and this triggers Jack into mercilessly pummeling Jesse in vague retribution. The SWAT arrive and Jesse and his henchman Styx are arrested and sentenced to death. While on death row though, a shady government organisation arrive at the facility and take Jesse away. These are the ATG, or Anti-Terrorist Group, a secret government project that's working on creating an army of cyborg super soldiers. They've apparently been working with the designs from the first film and managed to upgrade the new cyborgs with various targeting devices, detachable weapons upgrades, and most crucially, they've instilled the Borgs with an element of humanity to allow them to reason, creatively think, and strategically plan. What could possibly go wrong with that? The cyborgs are allowed to use reason and judgment, but are kept in line via a bracelet that the scientists keep a hold of that allows them to override the cyborgs' feelings on situations and basically force them to do whatever is required. The bracelet also contains a blow up all the cyborgs button in case any of the cyborgs start misbehaving. And wouldn't you know it, the ATG are using death row inmates as test subjects. And wouldn't you know it, Jesse has been picked up to get the full Super Soldier Cybernetic upgrade. Rechristened Spartacus, he's pretty much seen as the squad leader for the other cyborgs. But if you've been drinking heavily and forgotten the tone that this film is going for, stupid. It's not all roses and robots. Spartacus auto-activates himself, kills a decent chunk of the scientists and guests at an event to mark the launch of the super soldiers, takes one of the bracelets and has all the other ones destroyed. He then activates a handful of cyborg super soldiers, blows up the facility and heads out in a small truck with his troops. Anyway, after a short time, Jack's recalled back to the office, where the captain fills him in about Mike and the situation around Jesse. And it appears a cover story's been leaked to the press that Jesse somehow managed to escape death row and is currently on the run. Jack immediately heads out with one thing on his mind: to recapture Jesse and get justice for Mike. Jack's boss is very reluctant to let him proceed, but knows that there isn't really much he can do to stop him. Jack heads to death row, where Jesse's old partner Styx tells Jack that Jesse didn't escape and that he was transported off the premises by goons. With limited information, Jack heads to a ranch in a nearby town to talk to an ex-sheriff called Sam, who was looking into the ATG and was retired after he nearly stumbled on their secret super cyborg plan. It's then revealed that the sheriff who replaced Sam is a bit of a stooge to the ATG and is going to make Jack's life very difficult if he doesn't forget what he's learnt so far and leave town. These cops are operating on a federal level and they warn Jack that they will take him down if he doesn't stop this. Jack responds to this by smashing the place up and warning the feds not to fuck with him. How'd you like them apples? It's at this point that we then cut back to the cyborgs, who are about to set in motion their big plan for the movie. They break into a power plant to the south of the town owned by the ATG, murder everyone there and set up a base of operations. Their plan's simple. They're going to capture and convert or enslave as many of the town's population as possible, then use their new army to seize the next town, and then the next town, and then eventually the state, and then the country, and finally the world. Eventually becoming a bit like a shit version of the Borg or the Cybermen. Jack, meanwhile, breaks into a facility owned by the ATG, and after snooping around and doing some hacking, he eventually learns about the ATG and Project Hurricane, which is the super soldier experiment. He also learns that Jesse was captured and taken to an ATG lab to be turned into a cyborg. Jack manages to escape and heads back to Sam so that they can cross-reference stories and bring each other up to speed. He then goes over to call his captain to fill him in on the story when the town's feds ram his phone box over and then warn him politely to please stop looking into this. While this is going on, the ATG receive word that their southern power plant has been captured and they decide to cut the power to the facility as a way to try and smoke the cyborgs out. This doesn't work though, as the cyborgs just decide fuck it, we'll run the place on diesel. And a half dozen of them head out to the nearest petrol station, wreck up the place and try to steal the entire site's fuel allowance. That is until Jack turns up, a fight breaks out and Jack ends up blowing Spartacus into tiny little pieces. The cyborgs recover Spartacus and take him back to the plant, and the ATG arrest Jack and take him back to headquarters for interrogation. With time running short and a Terminator-style apocalypse almost imminent, will Spartacus succeed in converting most of the humans into super soldiers and enslaving the rest of humanity to do his bidding? Will Jack manage to convince the ATG that he's actually a pretty stand-up bloke who just wants to prevent the apocalypse? And why is Jack's son in this? The kid's got like 2 scenes and that's it. What's the point? All these and more will be answered if you take a chance on Cyborg Cop 2. One of the biggest issues that I had with the original Cyborg Cop was its script. As mentioned, I kind of felt like it tried to be 2 things at once and as a result failed to be either. Well, there's no chance of that happening here. This is positively comic book-esque and full-blown Looney Tunes at its best. The main plot is absurd, it makes absolutely no sense and is played out in such an over-the-top, overhyped way that I just fell in love with this thing almost immediately. The pacing's ludicrous, with fight scenes running for what feels like months and which swing violently between being a bit boring to being absolutely hilarious because they're going on for so long. It's clearly all padding designed to get to that sweet 90-minute runtime, but because the scenario is so bizarre and because the dialogue is so over the top and hammy throughout the whole thing, it just leads to this wonderfully semi-unhinged production that just made me laugh more than anything else throughout. There are clean and defined acts here, which is nice and really gives the film a sense of scale and progression throughout. And while tonally this film's off in wacky world for most of the runtime, I can kind of forgive it because it's fun while it's doing it. The film has multiple plot holes. As mentioned earlier, Jack's son is brought into the film for literally 2 scenes, a 5-minute scene at the beginning of the film and as a moment of peril in the 3rd act, but that's it. He's not seen from or heard of again more or less for the rest of the runtime, which is just amazing. The balls of this film to think that it could get away with doing that. It regularly gets lost in its own motivation, with a decent chunk of the film being about Jack trying to get revenge for Mike, but then, because Mike wasn't really introduced, the audience can't really mourn appropriately because they have no investment in the character. This also gets muddied with Jack doing a lot of investigating off his own back. He gets so involved that you actually start to wonder, is Jack actually doing this because he's motivated by his deceased colleague, or is he doing this because he himself just wants to know? The film at this point has become so far removed from its own groundings set up in the original that even the title of this film at this point makes absolutely no sense. In the first film, it kinda did work because the film was called Cyborg Cop and it involved Jack's cop partner becoming a cyborg. This film's called Cyborg Cop 2, and the only thing that makes that title even remotely accurate is that it has a cyborg in it and a cop. That's it. The rest of the movie is just Jack chasing down Jesse and Jesse trying to trigger the robot apocalypse. Add in some of the most cliched moments you can possibly stuff into a movie and the hamtastic dialogue, which is just astounding. David Bradley's Jack here is just a quit machine. Seriously, I don't think he has one sincere line in this entire movie, and you have something that borders on Samurai Cop levels of so bad it's good. The script was written by John Stevens Allon and was co-written and directed by Sam Furstenberg. We've already covered Furstenberg's career across multiple American ninja movies and, of course, the original Cyborg Cop, but John is new to the party and brings with him 5 writing credits, with this movie being slap bang in the middle of his writing career. His last credit was in 2003, and I think this is almost certainly his most memorable credit. I really can't see him topping this in terms of pure cheese. The direction here is actually pretty solid. While the original Cyborg Cop looked a bit more filmic than this does, this is edging a bit closer to big budget TV movie territory, and honestly, given the quality of the script, I think the step down in scale actually helps level things out and make them somewhat more acceptable. It's clear Furstenberg's style has developed a bit from the first Cyborg Cop. With a lot more stylization on hand to really help sell the lab scenes with the cyborgs, and to make things like explosions, of which there are plenty, look and feel as grand and as exciting as they should be. Furstenberg's an action director first and foremost, so even a day where he's off is still going to be pretty solid as a venture. And here, it really has a strong visual identity that pretty much instantly lets you know that this film is from the guy who made American Ninja 2. The direction of the cast is pretty decent fun as well. Cast members were seemingly encouraged to explore and interact with their surroundings, and there's a really decent attempt to utilise as much of the space as is possible and to really get to grips with the various staircases, drain pipes and other such props and locations dotted throughout. There's a certain manic energy that's being pulled from these performers throughout the film, and it's nice to see a director approach a film like this with that kind of hyperactive twist. In fact, the only issues I really have with the direction are that this film feels a little more sleazier than the original. The film opens with several very gratuitous semi-nude shots of women, which feels a bit icky. And the other thing is, and I've banged on about this way too much already, but it's just the fact that this film borrows, liberates, blatantly steals, so many little bits and moments from RoboCop 2 and Terminator 2 that at times I felt like just ejecting the disc and going to watch RoboCop 2 or Terminator 2. We have costumes, shots, exact scenes, tons of minor stylistic choices that were clearly just pulled out of a pea soup haze of a weekend of drinking wild turkey and watching those two movies one after the other again and again. It's so close to plagiarism, but it just manages to keep things different enough to avoid the lawsuits. But in many ways, that just made it funnier. The reason RoboCop 2 and Terminator 2 worked as well as they do is because they had an absolutely insane budget behind them. This film has a not unreasonable budget, but nowhere near enough to make a spectacle. I mean, the cyborgs in this movie wear sexy metal pants, and they could only afford to give each actor one cyborg leg, so they have a normal human leg as well. It's just so much fun to see where the budget went, or rather didn't went. The cine actually feels quite a bit tighter on this one than the attempts made in the original. We get a wider variety of shot types, tighter cuts, and better constructed sequences that actually feel like they convey more of the story to the audience. While I don't recall anything particularly special in amongst the shot types for this one, it was nice to see actual care made to make use of the sets, to actually create something that felt a bit more believable than the first effort. Where most of the sets looked like props just sat on a soundstage leading into a void, here we actually get some really solid location work, some decent sets, and a wider variety of props, with things like the lab in particular actually starting to look the part. Performance-wise, this film is immaculate. If you're looking for the perfect example of good-bad performances, this movie's got you covered in spades. No one is aiming for a believable performance as the cast hurtle closer and closer to frothing at the mouth level rabid the further into the film we get. David Bradley is astounding as Jack in this, simultaneously trying to give emotional weight to his mission while being a character whose main characteristic is to just not give a shit about anything or anyone. Every other line is a quip, and when one of the directors of the ATG called Liz turns up, Bradley changes tact and instead lets Jack's penis do the talking, with weird overly flirty lines that are just astounding to see performed in the way they are. Morgan Hunter is amazing as Jesse, giving a performance in the first half of the film that would make Dennis Hopper look like Anthony Hopkins. He absolutely owns and dominates most of the scenes he's in and is perfect casting for a film that's this unstable. Equally, I should probably take a minute just to praise the fight choreography. It's incredibly stupid and silly. Most fight scenes end with an explosion of some kind, but given how daffy the script is, how wild the performances are, and just how tonally weird this thing is, I think the over-the-topness really helps to take this thing to the next level. Equally, a gripe I had with the original Cyborg Cop was a lack of any kind of blood and poor handling of soft contact fights, and it appears that this has more than been remedied for this film, with plenty of bloody gunfights and even the odd fist fight where the connections are masked pretty decently, and it looks like the cast are having fun. Is it the most original set of fight sequences in cinema history? No, but with most of the key scenes ending in such an over-the-top way, I can kind of give this one a bit of a free pass for not landing the absolute basics 100% originally from a creative standpoint. The rest of the cast are pretty much avatars, or at least the closest to avatars as you can get. Jill Pierce and Victor Melanie probably just squeeze over the line for me as Liz and the retired Sheriff Sam. They aren't particularly charismatic, they just play well off Bradley's Jack. But the rest of the cast really just fail to light any kind of fire. They're mostly okay to passable. That being said, who needs additional cast when your core players are all playing their performances at 11 and there's an explosion every 10 minutes? And finally, the soundtrack. It's so lame, like easily one of the lamest action movie scores I've ever heard. It's entirely MIDI synthesized and every single composition feels like the weediest, wimpiest nerd tried to make something that sounded so rock and roll. The result is music that sounds almost like pages from CFAX at its most electronic and carries with it all the tension and pumping action of a superglued snail. It's just absolutely dreadful, and a knock-on of it being so badly put together is it actually makes the more serious moments in the film unintentionally hilarious. Seriously, with a rescore that actually made it sound like a more action-oriented soundtrack, this thing might have actually struck a nice balance of ridiculous to heartfelt. As it stands, I laughed my arse off at various points throughout this film. Oh, and there's also several moments of utter shonk on the ADR front. Overdubs that clearly weren't recorded anywhere near the actual set, and a total mismatch between the on-set audio and the studio stuff, which, in my opinion, only added to the so bad it's good experience. Cyborg Cop 2 was released on VHS in 1994 by Columbia TriStar Home Video? What? Alright. It was produced and distributed in some territories by New Image, who had previously done similar with the original Cyborg Cop, and they're still going today with recent hits including The Expendables. It received a DVD release in 2002 by Hollywood DVD and was also released on multiple multi-film compilation sets over 2002 and 2003. My version came courtesy of the American Heroes 3 set, which gathered 4 Hollywood DVD releases together onto 2 DVDs, but it's been released on a few of those types of sets and usually goes for cheap as chips. No extras on this one, just the film and scene select, and the menu is literally just a still from the film with a stretched out of shape low-res image of the Cyborg Cop 2 logo. And since then, that's it. It hasn't had a Blu-ray release, but God, I wish it did. Cyborg Cop 2 is a big, dumb, stupid movie, and I loved it for that. It's picked an angle and it's riding it hard into the dirt, and I really kind of have to respect that. This is a true so bad it's good feature, and within about 10 minutes of hitting play, I really began to realise that I may have found something rather special here. With solid enough direction and cine, manic and trash-tastic performances, and a ridiculous script, Furstenberg here appears to have committed some kind of alchemy, as I don't think I've seen a film that works so well in some regards but falls hard in so many other ways, to the point that they fall so hard that they end up enhancing the film and unintentionally improving it. I can totally see why Riff Tracks picked this movie up, and if you have nothing to do this weekend and are looking for a pick-me-up, I can highly recommend Cyborg Cop 2.